Welcome attendees to the Canadian Gas Association's Net Zero 2050 workshop. My name is Paul Chiliak. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Delivery with the Canadian Gas Association. We're happy to have you with us today to learn, to share, and to debate. The Canadian Gas Association is the voice of Canada's natural gas delivery industry. Our members operate 575,000 kilometers of underground infrastructure that meets the energy needs of 20 million Canadians every day. We also operate natural gas storage facilities that can hold 90 days worth of natural gas demand. Think of it as Canada's largest battery. Today's workshop will form the basis for what we hope to be an ongoing dialogue in Canada on the future role of regulated gas delivery companies, the future of Utility Act legislation, economic regulators, and of course, consumers. Energy used in Canada flows through a rate-regulated asset, 35% via the natural gas system, 20% through the electric system. For Canada to make meaningful progress on its 2030 and on its 2050 emission reduction goals, it will need to rely heavily on rate-regulated systems. The question is, are legislative and regulatory constructs that underpin rate-regulated energy delivery systems structured to enable emission reduction investments? Further, what is the role of the utility and how will they reform and modernize over time? That is the basis for our discussion today. We have with us hundreds of attendees, 450 registered, with an excellent cross-section of government, regulators, the legal community, Indigenous groups, and energy industry representatives. We have attendees from every region where natural gas is used in Canada today. We invite you to use the chat function today. If you have a question, please use the chat. If you have ideas about future concepts and sessions for us to explore, please let us know, also via the chat. A quick overview on the functionality of our technology today. You will see on the left-hand side a series of icons. Please feel free to explore those icons where you will see notifications, registration details, chat windows, and attendees. Please use a headphone or headset when you're speaking, and we recommend the use of Google Chrome as your browser. The Live Now button you see on your left will be used to do polling and to ask questions. Please familiarize yourself with the Live Now function. Under Live Now, you will see a couple options. Again, to ask a question, to see speaker details, etc. You can familiarize yourself by clicking on Live Now. To vote during a poll, click on Live Now and simply click Vote Now. There will be a few virtual polls throughout the course of the day. My pleasure now to introduce to our MC and our rapporteur for the day, Monica Gadinger. Monica is a full professor at the University of Ottawa, chair of positive energy. Further, Monica is director of the Institute of Science, Society, and Policy. She is a frequent commentator on energy regulation, trust, and legislative matters. Monica, we very much look forward to your expertise to guide us through the day, and the floor is now yours. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. As Paul mentioned, I'm chair of Positive Energy. We're a research and engagement program at the University of Ottawa focused on how to build and maintain public confidence in decision-making for Canada's energy future. Our work underscores how important it is to ensure decision-making systems for energy strike a workable balance between economic, environmental, social, and security imperatives, both in the short and the long terms. It's a tall order, but it's absolutely essential to secure public confidence, investor confidence, community confidence, and government confidence in the energy decisions on the road to 2050. When it comes to 2050, to date, much of the focus in Canada has been at that broad policy level, the what of 2050. It's also been on technological innovation, the technologies that are going to be needed when it comes to the coming decades. Far less attention has been paid to the how, how are we going to achieve 2030 and 2050 targets in the real worlds of energy decision making? That's where this workshop comes in. Its focus is on a crucial slice of the how, the role of rate-regulated gas utilities on the road to 2050. We'll be addressing a number of key questions. What is their contribution to net zero by 2050? What are the obstacles to their making that contribution? What reforms to current utility decision-making, whether policy, legislative, regulatory, or industry decision-making, will be needed? Our aim is not to answer all of these questions today. They're big, weighty questions, but rather to develop a better understanding of the issues. We've got 4 great sessions this afternoon. We'll start in a moment with an opening plenary on federal climate policy. This is going to position the day in the context of net zero. We'll then move right away to a session on net zero natural gas pathways. What are the key paths to 2050 for regulated utilities? Following this, we'll take a short break and reconvene with a panel on natural gas delivery industry leadership in emissions reductions with a stellar panel of industry representatives. Our final panel focuses on consumers and affordability with a diverse group of speakers representing residential consumers, industrial consumers, youth, and civil society. And we'll conclude the day by 3:30 Eastern Time and have you out to the remainder of your days. It's important to note, as Paul noted, that this workshop is a launch pad for a series of future conversations on this topic. There's a lot of work to be done to both understand the issues and identify how to transform utility decision-making to maximize the role regulated utilities can play on the road to 2050. This is going to involve research, it's going to involve thinking about legislation, it's going to involve some looking in the mirror, and more. Following the workshop, I'll be drafting a report with recommendations for action, including the roles and responsibilities of various players in the sector, along with action items for next steps. So as Paul noted, please feel free to use the chat to share your views, your questions, your comments, and your ideas. With this information in hand, let's get started. So our first speaker is Doug Nevison. Doug is Senior Economic Advisor to the Deputy Minister at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Doug has graciously agreed to step in for John Moffat, ADM Environmental Protection at ECCC, who was unfortunately called away. So thank you, Doug, for that. Mr. Nevison provides strategic advice on the development and implementation of key dimensions of the Government of Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan, and he is leading the design of the Net Zero Challenge. Doug, over to you.
Thanks very much, Monica. Sorry, apologies for the delay getting online with my camera. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be participating in this event today, and I honestly think that a workshop on the opportunities and challenges associated with net zero is very timely, given the flurry of recent net zero related announcements that we've seen both in Canada and abroad. Indeed, countries representing nearly 70% of the world economy have pledged to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And in response to rising demand from investors, shareholders, clients, and customers, an increasing number of businesses are adopting net zero targets and joining international campaigns such as the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So given this momentum, today I thought I would focus on a couple of federal government initiatives aimed at helping Canadian businesses with their net zero plans. So to start with some context, it seems like a long time ago, but back in December of 2020, the government released its Strengthened Climate Plan, which was entitled A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. And the aim of this plan is to allow Canada to meet and exceed its current 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target and set a path for net zero by 2050. Now, something that's not mentioned in this particular slide is that the fact that just previous to the announcement of the Strength and Climate Plan, the Government of Canada also tabled net zero legislation in November that will require the government to publish 5-year rolling targets and plans. And it also established a net zero advisory body to provide independent advice to the government on the most impactful and economically viable pathways to net zero by 2050. Now, coming back to the Strength and Climate Plan itself, the plan included a couple of measures, as I mentioned, that are aimed at helping Canadian businesses with their net zero plans. One was called the Net Zero Challenge, which is a voluntary initiative targeted to businesses. And another one that I mentioned is the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator, which will invest in significant decarbonization projects. Now, these are just a couple of elements to the plan. There were other ones which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, including the recent announcement on the hydrogen strategy, which recognizes the role of the natural gas transmission and distribution industry that it plays in developing the hydrogen economy in Canada. It also builds on some existing initiatives, such as the Low Carbon and Zero Emissions Fuel Fund. That's a $1.5 billion fund that's aimed at increasing production of low carbon fuels, such as renewable natural gas. I'm going to focus in the time I have this morning this afternoon on the Net Zero Challenge. But if you are interested in, for example, the Net Zero Accelerator or some of the other programs that the Government of Canada has, we do have a sort of slide at the end of this package which provides some contact information so that you can get in touch with us and have a chat about those particular initiatives. So with respect to the Net Zero Challenge and the purpose of the initiative, what we're hoping to do is encourage Canadian businesses to develop and implement credible and effective plans to transition their operations to net zero emissions by 2050. And in terms of more specific goals, what we would like to see is a normalization of net zero planning, such that it becomes a default business practice in Canada. We also want to build on the momentum that I mentioned that's happening both in Canada and internationally by providing guidance and incentives, such as, for example, a link to the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator. And ultimately, we want to see real reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial and other sectors, consistent with Canada's commitment to reach net zero by 2050. In terms of the target audience, this is a voluntary initiative, so all companies with net zero aspirations are welcome to join, including small and medium-sized enterprises. We are envisaging at this stage 3 different streams which recognize the opportunities and challenges associated with different sectors of the Canadian economy. The first stream would be for large industrial emitters, which is the primary focus of this particular initiative. The second stream would be for financial institutions, and this recognizes the influence that these firms have from both with respect to their lending and their investments. And finally, we would have a stream for non-industrial companies. And as I mentioned, the participation guidelines would be tailored for each particular participation stream. Now, this slide lists some potential requirements for the challenge. And I use the word potential since we are still in the design phase of this initiative. So nothing is set in stone at the moment. And we certainly welcome feedback from potential participants and the Canadian companies that have already put in place net zero plans. And we have had a very significant outreach sessions with a number of companies to try to work on the design features of this particular initiative. As it stands now, we would expect a company to sign a commitment letter which pledges to reach net zero emissions by 2050. We would also expect participants to develop a preliminary net zero plan within 12 months and a more detailed plan within 24 months of joining the challenge. We would expect participants to report regularly on the progress and to share publicly information on their plans and their progress. Now, with respect to the plan itself, we would expect it to describe the mitigation actions that the company would take to reduce its emissions. We would also hope to see interim targets for GHG reductions, and we would be seeking to achieve maximum reductions in the early years. And I should note that just in terms of these draft design elements, they reflect the growing number of international net zero initiatives and domestic plans. We've been looking very closely at these various approaches as we're very conscious of the need to align the net zero challenge with these approaches in order to minimize any additional administrative burden for Canadian companies. And finally, in terms of the initiative's value proposition, we hope that it will help companies demonstrate to investors, shareholders, and customers their commitment to taking substantial action on climate change. And we hope that the challenge would lend credibility to these commitments. In terms of sort of more specific benefits, we think that will lead to increased recognition and investor confidence, particularly as ESG criteria become increasingly important in investment decisions. We also think there's an opportunity for corporate learning through the sharing of best practices and guidance. And in this sense, we hope that we can support companies in developing and implementing net zero plans in a way that is as efficient and as effective as possible. So I think I'll stop there just in the interest of time. I hope everybody found that helpful and setting some context for your discussions this afternoon. I would certainly welcome any comments or questions that you might have during the time we have remaining. But also, if you want to get in touch with us afterwards to have a chat about these types of programs, whether it's the Net Zero Challenge or the Net Zero Accelerator or some of the other programs that the Canadian government has put in place, this last slide provides some information on how you can reach us, and we would very much look forward to hearing from you. So Monica, I think I'll stop there, and I hope that's keeping you to your time schedule to start. I hate to be the first speaker and go over time, so I hope you found that helpful.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Doug. You've set the bar high, so be warned, forthcoming panelists. Stick to your time. Well done. Thank you so much, Doug, for sharing with us that information. And I think it's really interesting to note that you are still in the design phase. So I think the timing of this presentation is really fortuitous. It gives people an opportunity to see, sort of what you're up to, where you're going, and that you're, interested in getting feedback and input from people. So I want to invite people at this time to start posing your questions using the question function. If you hit the live button, as Paul mentioned, you should be able to type in a question at that point. So I'm going to be monitoring those and posing them to Doug. We've got about 20 minutes or so here for questions. So don't be shy. Please do jump in. So as questions start to roll in, I'm just going to start with a question for you, Doug, and it was actually submitted by an attendee of the session in advance of the session. And it's a general question for you around climate policy and the relationship with industry. So here it is. How does Canada's climate policy help guide our industry's direction? Does it point to certain areas we should focus our efforts in, or others we should get out of?
Well, that's an awfully big question. So thank you for that. I think as a starting point for responding to that, I think we recognize that, there are many pathways to net zero. and there is significant uncertainty with respect to the pathways going forward. And I think in your opening remarks, Monica, you mentioned, the impact of technological change, for example. We're looking at a 2050 target, and we are hoping that the technological advances will come on stream in a commercialized way that can help us on that front. But it's at this stage of the game, we have to be flexible in terms of how we approach these things. But I think a few things are clear. To meet our net zero goals, Canada's economy is going to have to be powered by two equally important energy sources. The first is clean electricity, and I think the second is low carbon fuels, such as clean hydrogen, advanced biofuels, liquid synthetic fuels, and renewable natural gas. But coming back to the title of this session, this technology, or the effective use of low carbon fuels, isn't just a pathway to net zero. One of the key words that certainly my minister always stresses in these types of discussions, and it was part of the title for this workshop, is the opportunity side. Mm-hmm. And I think it's clear that could be significant economic opportunities associated with this transition to low carbon fuels across the country. And if I understand it correctly, the CGA and its members have already been active in this particular space through a number of pilots and demonstration programs. And I think in this respect, the Strengthen Climate Plan, which is a very broad plan. I think a lot of the focus has been on carbon pollution pricing. But there are 64 measures in the Strengthen Climate Plan. There's about $15 billion worth of investment in the plan. And again, I think this provides new opportunities for the CGA, its members, and the natural gas industry more generally to work together on this net zero transition. I mentioned the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator. That's a $3 billion program to help with clean technology. But I should also point out that my colleagues at ECCC, are also willing to work with natural gas producers to look at some of the barriers, for example, to adopting new technologies. And I think that just recognizes the fact that, again, coming back to my initial point, it's clear that we all have to work together to achieve this particular goal. This is a transformational goal. It's going to require industry, all levels of government to work together. I think the role of government, or governments more broadly, not just the federal government, but obviously provincial and municipal as well, and Indigenous organizations too. We have to help build an enabling policy environment, but we also have a role to play in terms of de-risking investments in innovative technologies. So that's pretty long-winded response to a pretty broad question, but I think it does just point to the fact that discussions like these are very important, and not just as a starting point, as I think you mentioned. This is the starting point of these discussions, and we need to keep them going as if we're going to achieve our climate objectives.
Well, and I think, in fairness, the question is asking about the next 30 years. So providing a response that's anything less than a few minutes long is probably a challenging thing to do. That said, one of the things that I think, the 2050 targets really open up is these milestones along the way. So we have 2030, we have 2050. It starts to put the mind in the mind frame of what are the short-term things that we can do, the sort of more low-hanging fruit, and then what are the longer-term things that we need to be thinking about and planning for now. So I suspect, a workshop like today's is going to be really beneficial in terms of identifying where some of those key opportunity areas are, and also, as you know, where some of the key obstacles are. I think we'll be hearing today from a number of regulated utilities that have, tremendous ideas and lots of opportunities, and then it's identifying, how do you support the deployment of those as rapidly as possible. So I'm going to start. I see there are some questions rolling in. So the first one here is, and you'll pardon me, I have to look over to the side to get the question. So my apologies for that. So the question relates to regulators, and the question reads as follows: should regulators have a seat at the table at government discussions on clean energy targets, where they can show, number one, how regulators can use incentive regulation to motivate utilities to achieve government clean energy targets, and number two, to identify where government funding is needed in order to bridge the gap on initiatives that have broader societal benefits. So it really gets to this issue, Doug, that you've raised about collaboration and sort of what is the nature of that policy regulatory relationship going forward for some of these big questions.
Yeah, I noticed that seat at the table is put in quotes, and I would say, seat at tables, because, I think we need to have multiple discussions, dialogue, engagement as we move forward. All aspects of, or all players in the issue, and again, as I said before, this is going to require transformational change across the economy. All sectors of the economy are going to need to be involved. So yes, having seats at the table is going to be very important. There'll be multiple tables. I think workshops such as this are a very good initial step. We've had, as I said, in terms of, for example, working on this net zero challenge, which we would see as a table going forward. Another table, let's say. We are hoping that the companies that commit to the net zero challenge will get a seat at a table that gives them sort of access to government policymakers, for example, other companies that are on the same pathway, yes, these discussions are going to be incredibly important going forward, because, as I mentioned, there are numerous pathways to get there. This is going to be, a dynamic discussion. This is not going to be static in any sense. We're going to have to, as technologies come on board and prove to be commercially viable, that will have an impact on the pathways. I should mention, just while we're talking about tables, and I mentioned it in my remarks, the government of Canada has also set up this net advisory experts body. It's 15 members from across the country. And they are now starting their own discussions with Canadian companies, other levels of government. They're starting their process of doing their due diligence so that they can provide advice to the government of Canada on this front. So I would highly recommend for people, that's another vehicle for keeping this dialogue going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a great point around, tables, plural. And are there tables we don't have that we need to create? Are there others that become less important over time, and the like? So as the questions are rolling in, and we do have a few more, but please don't be shy, forward them along. I did just want to note, because there were a couple of questions people were asking around whether presentations will be made available subsequent to the workshop, whether a recording of the workshop is going to be made available. And I would just like to confirm that the workshop is being recorded, and a recording will be made publicly available subsequent to today. And in terms of the presentations, I think we can commit to connecting with each of the presenters who've made a presentation, and if they are comfortable with it being shared, we would to make that available to everybody. So we have a few questions coming in, Doug, specifically about the challenge. So the first one here is, are there any additional financial incentives for companies who will enter the net zero challenge? For example, subsidies, because there are no penalties if companies don't sign on to the challenge. Interesting question. What's your sense?
Yeah, that's a question, and we've been discussing both internally within the government of Canada, but also with in our external consultation. As I think it's a very important one. We certainly want incentives to be a big part of what the net zero challenge offers. There, as I've said, we see incentives from a corporate learning perspective, but we are exploring sort of more direct incentives from a Government of Canada perspective. And I think the one that I mentioned a bit cryptically, I'll admit, because again, we're still sort of developing these proposals, is having some form of link to the Strategic Innovation Fund Net Zero Accelerator. As I said, it's a $5 billion program, and we are in discussions with our ICED colleagues who run the program to see if there's a way we could link the two, in the sense that we would sort of, it might be an expectation, for example, that that companies that get access to that financing would join the challenge, for example, at some point in the future. But so yes, it's a very important question, and as I said, we're looking into it, and I appreciate the question, because that helps validate the fact that this is an important aspect of it.
Right, in terms of what's the incentive to participate. I think there's another question here that sort of gets to the flip side of that, which is, would you foresee the development of a verification process or a reporting standard to provide evidence that carbon neutral activities are valid?
Yeah, that will be another key aspect of the design. In terms of sort of the criteria that we're looking at, obviously, as I said, we're looking for publicly available information, plans, interim targets, for example. On the sort of disclosure side, one of the aspects we're contemplating, and I think we're getting a fair bit of support, is on, for example, climate-related financial disclosures. When I talked earlier about building momentum, certainly there's a significant momentum behind enhancing climate-related financial disclosures in line with the TCFD requirements. So that could potentially be part of the program. Again, if we're trying to develop what does best practice look like from a net zero plan and commitment. And I certainly, given the companies that we've been talking to, some sort of TCFD related climate financial disclosure, I think, would probably be part of the mix. Again, nothing is set in stone at this particular point in time, but that's something that seems to be generating a lot of interest. We know that there are moves afoot to make this mandatory. At the moment, it's voluntary. So again, we've been following quite closely all the various international initiatives, what we're seeing in domestic plans. Certainly, that aspect of it is becoming more and more sort of best practice, and we would certainly look to build that into our plan itself.
Yeah, no, that makes lots of sense. Another couple of questions are coming in here, so we'll take those. How does the Net Zero Challenge fit in with the methane leak reduction strategies? Interesting point.
Well, I think they're all part and parcel of the sort of Strengthen Climate plan. The plan has, as I mentioned, a lot of different aspects to it. There are regulatory aspects. There's the pricing side that I mentioned, and we see the Net Zero Challenge as sort of a complement to those particular areas. I'll be honest with you, I am not an expert on methane regulation, so I won't go into that area, other to say that it's obviously an incredibly important part of the pathways that we've been discussing, and we certainly would want to be consistent when it comes to the Net Zero Challenge, being consistent with what we're doing on other sides of the policy spectrum.
Right. Okay. So kind of following up on that and taking it, I would say, a little bit further. So we've got kind of a double-barreled question here. One is, yesterday, and I'm just reading verbatim. Yesterday, we were advised 2019 emissions were higher than 2018 emissions. I'm sure you're well aware of that, Doug. This came out of your department. And roughly 2% below 2005 emissions. To reach our 2030 target, we need to increase the pace of reductions by roughly 25 times that rate. Net zero by 2050 requires an even more aggressive rate of reductions. And this after so-called low-hanging actions like coal-fired electricity generation elimination have already been done. Is there a conversation internally about how realistic the goal is? So that'd be the first question. We'll give you a bit of a chance to think on that. And then the second one is the cost of the net zero challenge is one that will ultimately be borne by all Canadians. Recent polls show they are unwilling to spend significantly more on to meet environmental objectives, particularly when so many are facing significant financial constraints. What effort is being undertaken to explain to consumers the costing of net zero for them?
Yeah, two very good questions. Thank you for those. Maybe I'll take the first one first. In terms of the reporting, I think that actually just shows how serious the situation is, and that the efforts that are being put in place through the Strengthened Climate Plan, through the net zero legislation, and through the actions, the voluntary actions that are being taken by a wide range of Canadian companies to take net zero commitments seriously, I think that supports that. I mean, as I said before, this is a long-term horizon that we're looking at. There will be variation year to year depending on all sorts of exogenous factors, but I think where I take comfort from is the building momentum that we're seeing, where net zero is, as I mentioned, becoming more and more sort of standard that's being set. I think, again, in terms of my sort of optimistic side, the fact that, the U.S. is raising the bar when it comes to ambition is going to be very important. And we know that the new U.S. administration will be holding a summit on April 22nd, which I think will, obviously have an opportunity to discuss where we are, but also ambition going forward is going to be a key part of that. On the cost side, again, on the net zero challenge itself, I mean, we're trying to help Canadian companies do their net zero planning in an effective and efficient way. As I said, the pathways are uncertain. We want to achieve, through things like the Net Zero Advisory Body, a sense of what is not just the most impactful, but what also is the most economically viable way to reach this target. But we're seeing, again, in terms of the momentum behind net zero commitments, a lot of it's coming from consumers, in certain sectors. So there is a growing recognition that this is a serious situation, and that the goal of net zero by mid-century is something we have to take seriously. So yes, there will be cost implications, but there will also be opportunities that may help as certain technologies come on board, may help make that pathway smoother for Canadian companies, but also for Canadian consumers.
Well, speaking of consumers, we do have a question on that front, actually. Somebody has asked or noted, the conversation seems to focus on industry. What about initiatives and or expectations for residential homes? So going to the point about consumers.
Well, again, I think the net zero challenge is just one aspect of the Strengthened Climate Plan, and one of the pillars of the Strengthened Climate Plan was helping residential, helping where people live, make it more affordable by increasing energy efficiency. So it's a key part of the Strengthened Climate Plan. It's one of the pillars. The net zero challenge is, as the individual noted, aimed more on the industry side. But as I said, it's part of a broader plan which tries to hit on all various sectors of the economy to achieve the goal, both for 2030 and ultimately for 2050.
Great. Thanks. So I see that we're just rounding up to the end of this session. So I wanted to, normally this would be the time where we would all clap for you, Doug. Unfortunately, we can't do that in a virtual workshop. So please, on behalf of all attendees and others, thank you very much. This was very informative. I think many will be watching the federal budget on Monday and looking for some of the spending commitments there as well. So thank you again very much for standing in for John Moffat We really appreciate your making the time today to be with us. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. And as I said, if anybody in the audience is interested in learning more about the Net Zero Challenge, or perhaps becoming a participant when we launch in the summer, please feel free to contact us through the information we provided. I hope you have a very good workshop and a nice afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much again, Doug. Bye for now. So our next session, we're going to move into it right away. It focuses on natural gas pathways. Pathways were mentioned quite a bit in this current session. Now we're really going to dive into that in terms of natural gas pathways to net zero by 2050. How do we get there? What are the scenarios? What are the pathways? We have two absolutely outstanding speakers to help us with that from ICF International. We have Duncan Rotherham, who's Vice President, Utility Programs and Services, and Peter Narbates, who's Senior Manager, Energy Markets, Gas. Together, they bring a wealth of experience in climate action and decarbonization policy, planning, projects, and decision-making, whether it's for industry, utilities, regulators, governments. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Peter, can you hear me? Okay, I think you're on mute still, Peter. First, thanks to the CGA for the opportunity to present today. Peter and I have about a dozen slides to run through in the next 20 minutes or so, with the goal of providing a view on the opportunity and the challenge associated with the transition to net zero emissions circa 2050 and a Paris plus 2030 target along the way. I'll provide a little high-level context over the next 4 slides, and then Peter will dive into the detail on the natural gas-related context. Since the 1990 Rio Summit, countries have broadly recognized the need to reduce emissions and have committed to a series of increasingly stringent emission targets. Canada's not alone in this area. Despite that, to date, emissions have increased since 1990, despite the Rio ambition and the Kyoto and Copenhagen Protocol targets. And again, in most developed countries with growing industrial economies, including Canada, emissions have remained stagnant since the 2000-2005 timeframe, despite the Paris Agreement commitments. So as such, as we look at the figure here, we're in a spot in Canada where the forward emission slope to 2030 is looking pretty steep and precarious. On a positive note, if we look at the annual compounding abatement required to get to 2030, it does not look as bad, illustrating the power of compounding. We can get to the 2030 target of around 510 million tons or so from today with an annual 3.5% reduction in emissions. But again, that abatement needs to begin pretty quick. We need to start to see a bend in the trajectory. Canada does not have a cap in place that would define and ensure that outcome. We have an escalating price instrument that climbs to $170 and serves to incentivize abatement that way. This significant price signal, coupled with our marginal abatement cost curve, and advances in technology like the electric vehicle, in theory, according to economic theory, should result in a reasonable chance of conformance with the 2030 target. However, this is not guaranteed. From my, maybe potentially jaded perspective, Canada's long imposed fuel taxes equivalent to the $170 per ton mark on fuels like refined petroleum product, with the goal of paying for transportation infrastructure, as opposed to creating abatement. And the fuel taxes to date really have had a very modest impact on demand. As such, it would appear we may need more prescriptive mechanisms than a carbon price, or in addition to a carbon price. And as we've just heard from Douglas, it appears the provincial and federal governments recognize this, as evidenced by the introduction of complementary mechanisms such as offsets and a clean fuel standard. You can slip to the next slide, Peter, thanks. Around 70%, or 500 million tons or so, of Canada's 730 million tons of emissions result directly from energy use for fuels like natural gas and refined petroleum product and electrical energy generation. It's critical to acknowledge that Canada's energy profile will need to change fast and significantly to meet these 2030 targets. And therefore important to have an appreciation of Canada's energy profile along with the emissions profile. So if we look at the chart here with the three main sources of energy, nat gas, refined petroleum product make up about equal amounts and together over 70% of energy use, while electricity contributes around a little less than 20%, or around less than a fifth. Residential and commercial users consume about 30% of total energy demand. Industry in Canada's industry-centric economy consumes 45%, and transport around a quarter. These three fuels vary in GHG intensity. Natural gas emits around 50 tons of CO2 per TJ, and combined around 200 million tons annually. Refined petroleum product emits more and is a higher GHG intensity, 70 tons per TJ, and combines to emit around 250 million tons annually. And then finally, electricity nationally has an emissions intensity of 30 to 35 tons per terajoule. However, that varies significantly province to province. So to come back around on the emissions target and recognize that we have sort of two broad opportunities, if you will, two levers to reduce emissions. We can reduce the amount of energy that we consume, and we can reduce the GHG intensity of energy that we use. The challenge of the 2030 target becomes, more clear in my mind. To get to that reduction required of around an incremental 200 million tons or so, just to illustrate the size of the abatement required, we'd need to reduce total demand of energy by 2,800 PJs, or around equivalent to the amount of Ontario's annual energy demand now, by 2030 from the Canadian economy. Or we can eliminate all transportation fuel use by 2030, or eliminate all nat gas use from all segments of the economy by 2030. So these are very significant energy efficiency and fuel switching measures that need to be achieved in order to get where we are now to the 2030 target. And obviously the intent isn't to illustrate that one of these three needs to be picked. It's going to be a combination of things in order to have a chance to get to 2030. So on slide 5, we pivot now into a little bit more of a look at natural gas. And under the reasonable assumption that the natural gas sector, from production and processing to transmission and distribution to end use, will need to reduce emissions considerably for Canada to be able to meet the 2030 target. It's clear that the emissions profile, that the full emissions profile must be considered, from fugitive emissions in the production segment to fugitive and venting in the processing and transmission and distribution segments of the life cycle, to combustion emissions related to transmission compression. And most importantly, given over 80% of the emissions occur at the point of combustion along the natural gas life cycle, the end user must be included to have any material reduction in emissions from this segment of the economy. So here focus must include, more measures aimed at reducing end user demand via expanding energy efficiency programs, and coupled with adding in low carbon fuels to the natural gas system, such as RNG and hydrogen, to dilute and reduce the GHG intensity of the fuel consumed. Slide 6. So this chart here up top with the various pie charts per province illustrates the primary energy source used for residential heating by province. The red illustrates the role that natural gas plays in residential heating by province, and the blue illustrates the electrical contribution to residential heating by province. This chart really serves to illustrate that the mix of measures will be very different by province to province, and ultimately the decarbonization pathways will not be the same in every province. They won't cost the same in every province, nor even be technically feasible at the same velocity in every province. So to expect a homogeneous emission reduction trajectory in every province is optimistic. For example, in Alberta, natural gas meets 75% of demand for residential heating, around the same in Saskatchewan, while in Quebec it meets only 10% of the residential heating load is met by nat gas, and the vast majority is met by electric, non-emitting electric in Quebec. Natural gas demand, unlike refined petroleum product, is seasonally peaky. If we look at how transportation fuel is consumed, it's pretty consistent. On a weekly basis, there's very little seasonal variation, and that natural gas peakiness is much more so than electricity in most provinces. So nat gas winter day demand can be 5 to 6 times that of summer day demand for electricity at the provincial, for natural gas at the provincial level. And on a comparable energy metrics basis, then that natural gas peak day demand for energy can be 4 to 5 times that of electric, and even higher in some provinces. And so this illustrates the challenge in fuel switching gas load to electric in a seasonally cold climate like Canada in that 2030 timeframe, or even in the 2050 timeframe. Just given that sort of the density of the energy and significance of the energy that natural gas currently meets. And finally, as discussed earlier, electricity GHG intensity varies province to province. So while nationally it's low, and in Canada's got a great electricity emissions story to tell, globally. In 6 provinces and territories, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, natural gas is actually a lower emitting form of energy currently than the provincial electric grid average. So challenging the logic to the optionality on fuel switching, at least in the short term, based on the existing GHG intensity of the electricity system, from nat gas fuel load to electric, won't always reduce emissions in the short term. So Peter, now after illustrating some of the sort of the broad context here, I'd like to hand it over to you to provide some insight into what we're seeing with regard to emission reductions in the nat gas area and where we expect to see things looking forward.
Thanks, Duncan. Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay, so let's jump into some of the emission reduction options here. Focused on customer emission reductions, which, as Duncan noted, were the biggest, by far the biggest part of the natural gas emission reduction from the gas value chain. And as Duncan noted, one of the first pillars or categories of natural gas emission reductions is really simply reducing natural gas demand. And there are a few options that we'll talk about here. First up is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency might not be the sexiest topic out there, but really is one of the key workhorses to reach our goals. And efficiency can mean many different things. So it could be better insulation so that we lose less heat from our homes and buildings, installing more efficient appliances and equipment in homes and buildings and factories. And there are also a number of promising emerging technologies out there on the efficiency side. So things like gas heat pumps that have efficiencies around 140% and represent more of a step change in the demand reduction that can be achieved for gas, space heating, and water heating. And one of the good news stories here is that utility energy efficiency programs have a long track record of driving significant and cost-effective emission reductions, and there's room to expand these programs further. Another approach we wanted to talk about today is to natural gas demand reduction is that's being considered more in light of net zero targets is what I would call hybrid heating. So what are we talking about here? Well, one approach could be for customers to install electric air source heat pumps to replace only the air conditioning unit that they have. So even though these heat pumps would be able to provide space heating, the hybrid customers would maintain their natural gas furnaces to provide backup heating when it's particularly cold or when intermittent renewable generation might be particularly low. So, these customers are still able to achieve major emission reductions by significant reductions in gas demand for space heating because they're using their heat pump for heating much of the year. But instead of installing electric resistance backup heating, gas furnaces would continue to meet peak space heating loads. And so the chart on the right here shows, one of the key reasons for these hybrid arrangements. So, electric heat pumps, their capacity is reduced at lower temperatures. They can't extract as much heat from the air. And then they also see their efficiency drop off at lower temperatures. So electric heat pumps typically rely on less efficient, only 100% efficient backup electric resistance heating for colder periods. And this causes spikes in electric demand and significant infrastructure required to meet relatively infrequent spikes on these colder days. So, while this arrangement, hybrid heating arrangement, might make sense in many ways and can be a more practical approach to electrification of space heating, it does represent a major shift in how gas utilities operate and raises a host of regulatory considerations. So, this would reduce overall energy system costs as opposed to, electrifying everyone, but and would reduce cost increases for electric ratepayers, but would put upward pressure on rates for gas customers. So again, a number of details that need to be worked out here. The next category that we wanted to talk about, another second pillar for emission reductions is reducing the GHG intensity of the gas that is being consumed. So one key part of this is renewable natural gas, which we like to call RNG. And RNG is derived from renewable sources and is fully interchangeable with conventional natural gas in our existing infrastructure. There are different approaches to emissions counting, but typically we treat the combustion of RNG as carbon neutral because it comes from biogenic resources. Today, most of the RNG produced is through a process called anaerobic digestion, which includes landfill gas and includes digesters that are built at wastewater treatment plants, but emerging processes called thermal gasification can unlock significantly larger supplies of RNG from feedstocks like forest product waste or even energy crops. The last kind of category here, which is sort of a blend between the RNG and hydrogen space, is power to gas, which again is producing gas from green hydrogen produced by renewable generation and electrolysis. So jumping into hydrogen then, depending on how it's produced, blue or green hydrogen promises to be a low or no emission fuel source. It can be leveraged to drive decarbonization through a number of different implementation approaches. So, one of the first and foremost items that gas utilities are looking at is blending hydrogen into their existing gas supply. So with existing infrastructure, we typically expect to be able to handle a volume in the range of 15 to 20% hydrogen without much modification. There's differences in the energy content and things that need to be accounted for there, but that's typically the expectation right now. To get to higher levels of hydrogen, there's a lot of discussion about hydrogen-specific infrastructure and the build-out of that in some cases. And then a third general category are just a number of categories or approaches that would convert hydrogen to RNG or to methane that could be used and be fully compatible with existing infrastructure. So this could be methanation, adding CO2 to hydrogen, and there are also options to add hydrogen to some of the thermal gasification processes that I spoke about briefly from the RNG perspective, which would significantly increase the yield of RNG there. A quick note here, it's also worth touching on Enercan's hydrogen strategy, which targets 50% of the energy supplied now by natural gas being replaced by different forms of hydrogen. Okay, so moving on then to, if there are all these options, great options for gas utilities to support customer emission reductions, why are we not seeing more of them implemented? Well, first, I'd say that we are seeing some of them implemented, and we'll give a few examples of that in a second. But before we do, it's worth noting that utilities can't act on their own here. Many of these opportunities to reduce emissions really require approval from regulators, policymakers, for the utilities to go forward. So, typical utility planning and regulation has involved, least cost approaches that don't always carve out an opportunity for these decarbonization approaches. And so it's also worth noting, Duncan touched on the carbon price, but with that significantly increasing out to 2030, there should be, an opportunity for utilities to be implementing more cost-effective emission reductions, and they should be empowered, I guess, to pursue emission reductions in that vein. Okay, so quickly going through some examples as we're a bit behind time here. We'll jump into BC, and I think this is a really good showcase for how gas utilities can be empowered to support their customers in achieving emission reductions. So one example here is energy efficiency. The table here shows how FortisBC's energy efficiency program budgets have been expanding. You can see a doubling from 2018 to 2020, with more growth planned out to 2022. So the utility is being given the opportunity to drive deeper demand reductions. Next up, RNG. The legislation in the province sets specific criteria that allow RNG projects to be developed, focusing on what the cost of that RNG is and capping the volumes, but providing a clear pathway that has allowed FortisBC to bring a lot of projects online. And then the last example here from the province is the Clean Growth Innovation Fund. So giving the utilities some flexibility to adapt and explore new ways to drive emission reductions, including exploring things like hydrogen use in their system. Next, I wanted to touch briefly on Quebec, and so while Quebec and the utilities there, like Énergir, are making a lot of progress with energy efficiency and RNG, I really wanted to touch on the province's dual energy program. So I think it's noteworthy that in this province with the most electric space heating, they already recognize the challenge that this causes with winter peak electric loads, and have around 200,000 customers on a special rate plan, which would automatically switch them to a backup fuel if temperatures drop to a certain level. And you can see here how they're offered significantly lower rates to participate in this program. And this really just touches on the hybrid heating approach that we discussed earlier, and showing how dual energy approaches can really be a win-win for both achieving emission reductions and lowering the overall cost for doing that. With some of the stuff at the bottom here showcasing Hydro-Quebec's perspective from the electric ratepayer on how it's a win-win-win for them. Quickly jumping to one last example from stateside, so Washington, D.C., where the gas utility put in place a plan showing how they could help the District of Columbia reach their targets for carbon neutrality. The pathway here pulls on a lot of different strategies to reach the target: energy efficiency, hybrid heating, RNG, hydrogen, and several more. But by doing this, we found a pathway that was less expensive than something that focused exclusively on electrification. And it's noteworthy here that gas utilities are increasingly studying these opportunities and building plans showing how their infrastructure can help be part of the solution, which is something that we're working with the CGA on right now as well. So that was a lot of content. We moved pretty quickly through there. We have a few parting thoughts before we get into questions. But first of all, I think we just wanted to note that building practical and achievable pathways for emission reductions really requires a deep understanding and appreciation for how gas and electric utilities operate, and kind of coordination and planning processes in the sector. Also, we wanted to really emphasize that there are opportunities to leverage gas distribution infrastructure to support these targets. That gas utilities can't act on their own. They need approval and enablement from regulators to go after some of these opportunities. And finally, that, really, a comment maybe to the regulators, but, you should be ready to consider new things, right? Because we're talking about evolving the gas distribution business model. And, some of these proposals would be more complicated and new, and will take a lot of work from the gas distribution companies to pull together. So, ideally, any guidance regulators can give that they're ready for these things will really, I think, facilitate some of that processes. Duncan, anything you wanted to add? Parting thoughts there?
Yeah, maybe just on the regulator and the utility commission bit in the United States. I think, really we're, and broadly in Canada, from listening in some of the context going on in BC and Ontario lately, I think, regulators and utility commissions are really going from tolerating to expecting to requesting to, borderline mandating these decarbonization pathways. And there's a need to bring together the gas and electric utilities as they try to solve this conundrum of how forward demand is going to be met in an economy that's using less natural gas. And I think that, we need to see a lot more of that, that expediting that regulatory or the utility commission, appreciation of tolerating these submittals to mandating them or expecting them and then mandating them.
Great. Duncan, Peter, I remember when we had a preparatory call for this panel, I think we sort of asked the moon of you, and you actually delivered. What a tremendous presentation. It just covered so much waterfront and really, I think, gave us the backdrop in terms of content that we're going to need for the remainder of the workshop. So we do have a few minutes left here for questions. And, to the parting thoughts, and Duncan, to the point that you just added, there's a question here that I think kind of tries to push it a little bit further. So here we go. Is there a need for increased dialogue between regulator and government as to the broader policy objectives utilities should be incented to achieve, for example, GHG reductions, and then for the government to empower the regulator to incent the utility to achieve them?
I think so. I think, the expectation of an outcome based on the carbon levy or the carbon price, I think, is overly optimistic. There needs to be an enabling of these utilities with an appreciation of their mandate and how they're regulated and their duty to deliver energy. And really just the sort of the proverbial turf that's legacy-wise been gas and electric. I think broadly there needs to be a coming together of that, and the federal government needs and the provincial governments need a much better appreciation of how to enable the utility to deliver the outcomes that are expected. Because right now, many of them are simply just passing along the price as their duty.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Duncan. And I think it really gets to the heart of why this workshop is so very important, trying to identify where some of those issues are. We have one other question I think we'll have time for, but I think it's a good one because it points to some of the challenges of the issues. So here goes. Some of the changes to consumption and building efficiencies seem to be more achievable for single detached buildings. My wife and I moved into an apartment style condo in anticipation of retirement, and these buildings don't seem easily modified to achieve these future efficiencies. Any thoughts? Good question in terms of the built environment and constraints.
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of challenges and opportunities, and that's why the basket of solutions really needs to be big, not small. But certainly some things like decarbonizing the gas supply allows emission reductions to be achieved where it's more challenging for equipment or infrastructure to be changed. So again, it's part of, I think, having a broad set of solutions that can be targeted to where they make most sense, and certainly there are options to go everywhere.
And I think maybe further to Peter's point, I think there's this irrational expectation that there's going to be a homogeneous abatement trajectory at a homogeneous cost, regardless of the country, regardless of the province, regardless of rural or urban, regardless of big building, small building, vintage of building. And I think we really need to calibrate around that, because this decarbonization pathway will not look and feel the same in any region. And we need to really capitalize on the cost-effective measures that are afforded in those regions with an appreciation of the energy profile. In order to have any chance of achieving these targets, basically reducing emissions before we run out of money.
Yeah, no, and I think, that slide, I think it was number 6 that you showed with the different provincial profiles was just so striking on that front. And of course, we also have different provincial regulatory frameworks across the country as well. So point well taken that this is likely to look different in different parts of the country. Different trajectories and pathways are likely to make greater or lesser sense depending on where you are. So we're going to hold it there.
And
Want to stay on time. Oh, sorry, one final thought.
I was going to say one last thing just quickly to build off what Duncan was saying. The equity part of rates is another component where, in some of these environments, if somebody is significantly reducing natural gas demand and rates go up, they might not, their overall bill impact might be more neutral, but ultimately not everyone is going to achieve the same efficiency reduction, and you're going to have some customers who can't reduce their demand and then are fielding, barring other changes, more of a cost increase from these transitions.
Yes, and I think we're going to hear that in some of our sessions coming up. So I'd like to thank you, Duncan and Peter, for such a rich presentation. This was phenomenal. I hope you'll be open to us sharing it with attendees. I expect there'll be lots of interest in that. It really helped to lay out both the opportunities as well as the challenges for gas utilities and all of us, frankly, on the road to 2050, as well as the scale of reforms that we're going to need to make to energy systems and to decision-making systems going forward. So it's it's exhilarating, but it's also a bit daunting. It's complex stuff with lots of moving parts. So our next set of panels will be diving into various aspects of these issues. For now, though, we have a 10-minute break for everyone to stretch their legs, reflect a bit on what they've heard, and get set for our next 2 panels. We will convene in 10 minutes' time